What sound was that? I turn away into the shaking room. What was that sound that came in on the dark? What is this maze of light it leaves us in? What is this stance we take to turn away and then turn back? What did we hear? It was the breath we took when we first met. Listen, it is here.
Welcome to the Fabled Remedies Podcast number 5, a love letter to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Boogermen, and wild folk. Today we invite you to join us on a silly and sacred journey into the 50 Shades of Sasquatch. Our goal at Fabled Remedies is to create a safe community to explore far-out ideas and celebrate the wisdom in the weird. My name is Grizzly, and with me as always, the hairy witch to my old skunky bill, Lucy.
I can't get over those names. We looked up a long list of names of Bigfoot.
Old Skunky Bill.
Old Skunky Bill.
Well, first of all, we want to wish you a very merry Lupercalia or St. Valentine's Day. And we ask if you enjoy what we do and want to support our family here on the Fabled Farm to please go over to fabledremedies.com. Follow, like, and share our podcast with the people that you love and help our community grow and blossom into a fun, safe place to share and explore this mystical situation we find ourselves in.
So we started off today's podcast with a poem called It Is Here by Harold Pinter, which I'm sure he intended for someone very sweet and not hairy and in the woods. But it's a nice, it kind of fits perfectly with you can envision a Bigfoot in the forest with that poem. So today's episode, honestly, this may be broken into 2 parts. We'll see. But Bigfoot. We wanted to focus on one of the biggest sort of concepts in paranormal mythological lore all around the world. And we have been pouring through an incredible amount of Bigfoot information, stories from around the world from all time, about all kinds of weird stuff. And we have picked out some of our favorite and most interesting pieces to present today in sort of a giant mishmash of just an ode to the entity that is commonly known as Bigfoot.
Yeah, we're going to try to cover as much ground as we can with this topic. It is huge. There are podcasts out there that are solely dedicated to Bigfoot. We don't want to just give you the basic rundown, so we're going to try to cover a lot of the fundamental and most famous stories of Sasquatch, but this podcast's goal is really to give you the most stories and the broadest examples of this phenomenon that have been going on since the beginning of time. And we're going to kick this thing off with the oldest account of what could have been an encounter with Sasquatch that we could find.
For the most ancient potential Bigfoot story, interestingly enough, that coincides with the most ancient story in general, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is from ancienttext.org. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, perhaps, the oldest written story on Earth. It comes to us from ancient Sumeria and was originally written on 12 clay tablets in cuneiform script. It is about the adventures of the historical king of Uruk, somewhere between 2750 and 2500 BCE. And yes, Uruk is in modern-day Iraq. You'll notice the similarity there. The context of the story here is the main character of the story, Gilgamesh, was created by the goddess Aruru to be the strongest of men. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, but is abusing his power and trampling its citizens like a wild bull. The people cry out to the god Anu, who is the father of them all, to do something to help the people. Here, the selection from Stephen Mitchell's translation of Gilgamesh. Anu heard them. He nodded his head. Then to the goddess, the mother of creation, he called out, "Aruru, you are the one who created humans. Now go and create a double for Gilgamesh, his second self, a man who equals his strength and courage, a man who equals his stormy heart. Create a new hero, let them balance each other perfectly so that Uruk has peace." When Aruru heard this, she closed her eyes, and what Anu had commanded she formed in her mind. She moistened her hands, she pinched off some clay, she threw it into the wilderness, kneaded it, shaped it to her idea, and fashioned a man, a warrior, a hero. Enkidu the brave, as powerful and fierce as the war god Ninurta. Hair covered his body. Hair grew thick on his head and hung down to his waist. He roamed all over the wilderness, naked, far from the cities of men, ate grass with gazelles, and when he was thirsty, he drank clear water from the water holes, kneeling beside the antelope and deer. One day, a human, a trapper, saw him drinking water with the animals at the water hole. The trapper's heart pounded. His face went white. His legs shook. He was numb with terror. The same thing happened a second, a third day. Fear gripped his belly. He looked drained and haggard, like someone who has been on a long, hard journey. He went to his father. "Father, I have seen a savage man at the water hole. He must be the strongest man in the world, with muscles like rock. I have seen him outrun the swiftest animals. He lives among them, eats grass with gazelles, and when he is thirsty, he drinks clear water from the water holes. I haven't approached him. I am too afraid. He fills in the pits I have dug. He tears out the traps I have set. He frees the animals, and I can catch nothing. My livelihood is gone." And then from there, basically, they go to get help from King Gilgamesh, and then him and Enkidu fight at first, and then they end up becoming best friends and help balance each other out. That's the gist of the story.
Like she said, the Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the oldest story written down that we've ever found. And we just wanted to highlight this short part because it contains many of the common experiences that people have dealing with Sasquatch, as far as messing with people's hunting traps and their campsites, instilling numbing fear upon someone when they encounter it. He's covered in hair, naked, running around the forest, talking to animals. And this really is a perfect modern description of what people experience when they have a Bigfoot encounter.
And yet it's like almost 5,000 years old.
Yeah, exactly. A common stance in the cryptid community today is the idea that Sasquatch is some kind of elusive relic hominid that survived in the wilds as the supreme hide-and-seek champion of the world. One example being Gigantopithecus. It's an extinct massive gorilla-like ape which lived approximately 6 million to 200,000 years ago, and it's believed to stand approximately 9 feet tall and weighed around 1,000 pounds. It's a big monkey.
That is a big monkey.
But the only remains so far discovered are teeth and 4 mandibles, making size estimates highly speculative. It lived in what is now Asia and was believed to be a herbivore and probably lived off of eating bamboo. The first published article about an encounter with a Bigfoot-like creature in the United States was by New York's Exeter Watchman. It was titled Another Wonder, and it's dated to September 22nd, 1818.
Reports say that in the vicinity of Ellisburg was seen on the 30th ULT by a gentleman of unquestionable veracity, an animal resembling the wild man of the woods. It is stated that he came from the woods within a few rods of this gentleman, that he stood and looked at him, and then took his flight in a direction which gave a perfect view of him for some time. He is described as bending forward when running, hairy, and the heel of the foot narrow, spreading at the toes. Hundreds of persons have been in pursuit for several days, but nothing further is heard or seen of him. The frequent and positive manner in which the story comes induces us to believe it. We wish not to impeach the veracity of this highly favored gentleman, yet it is proper that such naturally improbable accounts should be established by the mouth of at least 2 direct eyewitnesses to entitle them to credit.
So you can see this phenomenon has been going on for a very long time, and now let's look at a few examples around the world of Bigfoot-like creatures.
Honestly, we have a crazy amount of, there's so many different types of these reports from so many different cultures all around the world. So this is really just like a few that we're going to toss out as some examples. This article is from Gaia.com. Many cultures have their versions of the Yowie, including the American Sasquatch or Bigfoot, the Yeti or abominable snowman of the Himalayas, and the Brazilian Mapinguari. These are all creatures described as bipedal, larger than the average human, and covered in hair like an ape. Interestingly enough, those who do believe these creatures exist also say that they're likely to be close relatives of one another. As with many entities that mystify modern civilizations, the existence of such creatures is widely accepted as fact among indigenous cultures who've lived on the land and have intimately known of their existence since ancient times. The Kukuyalanji tribe of northern Queensland, Australia, have identified 2 tribes of Yowies and point to long, detailed records of Yowie attacks in their legends. One group is described as between 6 and 10 feet tall, about 1,000 pounds, and covered in thick hair. They're also said to have talons for fingers. This type is referred to as the Yahoo. The other Yowie group, known as the Junjudis, are believed to be smaller, around 3 to 4 feet tall. Both types have been documented on cave walls. Though Aborigines claim these creatures are real, they also regard them as mystical, referring to their magical powers. They've equated the Yowies with a figure from their own mythology, the Dulagahi, or hairy man, which they believe has existed since the dawn of time. And honestly, when we were preparing for this, there is an insane amount. There's like hundreds of different names and stories from different cultures throughout the history of the world. And so these are just a select few that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, definitely the challenge with this podcast has been how to compress such a massive amount of information into one show. So we will definitely have to dip back into this topic in future episodes. And there's also a lot of correlations with the Bigfoot phenomenon and a lot of other experiences people have, whether it be with UFOs, aliens, or fairies. And the folklore behind these creatures is immense. There's definitely something going on.
So one of the local examples to where my family lives in Florida is the skunk ape, also known as the swamp ape and Florida Bigfoot, is a purported ape-like creature that is said to inhabit the forests and swamps of some southeastern United States, most notably in Florida. Dave Sheely is the self-confessed expert on the skunk ape. He saw his first one when he was 10 years old in 1974, and he told Smithsonian Magazine, "I finally saw this damn thing, and it got away just like that." The Sheely family now operates the Skunk Ape Research Center in Okeechobee, Florida, and I checked it out on TripAdvisor, and it has really good reviews. So if you're in Florida and you're interested in the skunk ape, go check it out.
There was also a fantastic photo taken in 2001 called the Miyaka Skunk Ape photographs. And these are probably some of the clearest ones that I've seen, where it's not actually just like a blurry, hairy looking dude like running through the forest. It kind of looks more orangutan. It's like thick and hairy, and in the bushes, its eyes are glowing. And I'll go ahead and put that in the video on YouTube so you can see it. Or you can just Google the Miyaka skunk ape photographs, and you'll definitely find it, and it's worth checking out.
You know what it reminds me of is, gosh, what was that guy's name in The Labyrinth? He's like the big sort of ape blurt. What is his name?
I have no idea. You're the Labyrinth queen.
But like, look at that picture and tell me the way he's kind of like hulking over. Bluto, that was his name. Yeah, but like without the horns, he looks like Bluto. So to me, I'm like, yeah, he seems friendly. I don't know. There are many, many examples of Bigfoot-like entities in various Native American cultures. One that I thought was interesting is the Chietanka, meaning big elder brother. This is a woodland being in the Lakota and Dakota languages of the Great Sioux Nations. Some people associate this legend with Bigfoot. The Chietanka is a large, shaggy woodland being. According to various sources, Chietanka is a nature spirit and sacred messenger. A quote from Peter Matheson states, "My travels with Indians began some years ago with the discovery that most traditional communities in North America know of a messenger who appears in evil times as a warning from the Creator that man's disrespect for his sacred instructions has upset the harmony and balance of existence. Some say that the messenger comes in sign of great destroying fire that will purify the world of the disruption and pollution of earth, air, water, and all living things. He has strong spirit powers and sometimes takes the form of a huge hairy man. In recent years, this primordial being has appeared near Indian communities from the northern plain states to far northern Alberta and throughout the Pacific Northwest." So that is really interesting because it incorporates more elements than, oh, this is just a weird animal that's out there. But there's almost like this spiritual essence to it, and the connection to nature has much deeper meaning. And it is interesting how Bigfoot is becoming really popular in our sort of collective consciousness in the culture right now. I mean, there's like a bajillion Bigfoot shows on TV. Like, everybody's really familiar with the concept of it. And also, we are at the time where we're totally destroying our environment every day. So who knows, perhaps there's something to that.
And as we go farther, you all will probably definitely start picking up on the fact that, in our opinions, personally, we don't think that Bigfoot is just another monkey or gorilla species just out there in the forest hanging out. Personally, we believe there's a lot more to this phenomenon, and there is a lot of hostility for some reason, specifically in the Bigfoot community, where there is an effort for people to really fight to be scientifically legitimate, and that's okay. I hope we can all respect each other's opinions and just find some love and commonality in our journey to get to the bottom of the truth of these experiences, because I think that's the most important thing.
Exactly. Asking questions is what this is about, not necessarily having the answer.
Yeah, because the fact is that we don't have a body and we don't have 100% factual evidence, but there's a phenomenon that's been going on forever.
What does it mean?
So let's keep digging and looking and be open-minded so we can hopefully one day get to the bottom of this.
Across the country, stories of giants, gods, and ancient mythical beings are woven into the history of Mount Shasta. Native American legend says that Mount Shasta is the home to the keepers of the woods, Matakagmi. The Matakagmi are said to be 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in coarse hair, have brown eyes, and give off a musky odor. From the book Many Smokes 3 by Tawani Wakawa is a story Tawani Wakawa tells of the Sasquatch. In this story, Tawani Wakawa's grandfather was helped by 3 Matakagmi when he was bitten by a rattlesnake near Mount Shasta, California, around 1900. One thing that I think is really interesting about the name of this particular entity, Matakagmi, is that, okay, so the etymology of this word is that it is Klamath and Modoc, or a Penutian word. So that is from that area in the Americas. However, the word bears a curious resemblance to Meto Kangmi, which is a Tibetan name for the Yeti. So what does that mean?
That's really interesting.
Totally. That kind of blew my mind, honestly. And another example from South America is called the Ucumar, sometimes called the Ucu or Ucumar supai. And this is a type of Sasquatch from Argentina. The description we have here is that it is a hairy mammalian ape-like beast.
You describing me or?
Yeah. Well, it's described as 5 to 7 foot tall with thick hair, small eyes, and huge arms and legs. Some people reported it as half bear humanoid. So, I mean, it kind of does sound like you.
Grr.
According to local people, the Ucumar loves to eat a plant called payo, a plant with an inside similar to cabbage. The creature also emits the sound ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo, which Ivan T. Sanderson compared to the noises reported by Albert Ostman, who claimed to have been held captive by a family of Sasquatch in 1924.
And I'll be talking about that story a little bit later in the show.
Oh. In 1956, geologist Audio El Piche found 17-inch-long human-like footprints on the Argentina side of the Andes Mountains at a height of over 16,000 feet. The following year, similar tracks were discovered in the province of La Salta, Argentina. Not long after, residents of Tolor Grande informed newspaper reporters of a nightly chorus of what they described as eerie calls emanating from the nearby Curicuru Mountains. The cries, which were attributed by the locals to a creature known as the Ucumar supai, frightened the community for some time, and according to anthropologist Pablo Latapi Ortega, traditions of these giant ape men continue to this very day in Argentina. The other most known example of a Sasquatch-type creature from around the world that we referenced a little bit earlier is the Yeti, also known as the abominable snowman. This creature is purported to live in the Himalayan regions of Tibet and Nepal. It is a large cryptid, generally portrayed as being covered in white fur or hair. The Yeti appears under various names in legends from Mongolia to Nepal, but is often portrayed the same. The Yeti entered popular Western culture in the 19th century, but was originally a part of the culture and mythology of the inhabitants of the Himalayas, with some groups worshiping or revering the Yeti as a nature spirit. It is also referred to as the abominable snowman, but this term was not coined until 1921 by Charles Howard Bury, leader of the Joint Alpine Club and Royal Geographical Society. The key evidence for the existence of the Yeti was the photo of a footprint taken by British explorer Eric Shipton in 1951. And the photograph was taken on the Menlung Glacier west of Mount Everest on the Nepal-Tibet border. Shipton and Michael Ward were searching for an alternative Everest route when they came across the prints. Shipton was one of the most highly respected Everest explorers, so if he's bringing back a print, it's a real print. Nobody ever questioned that. But what is it remains. Yeah, we'll put a picture of this print up, but it's in very hard packed snow, so it's extremely crisp. If you're just listening on a purely audio format, I encourage you to Google it. Because you can see like all the individual toes, the shape of it's very straight. It's something. I don't know what it is, but it's from something.
It definitely has a more monkey looking foot than human, I would think.
So those are just really a smattering of the many examples of these types of entities around the globe. However, we happen to live in an area that has a pretty significant Bigfoot vibe going on, although here it's called the wood booger.
The wood booger is a Bigfoot-like creature said to roam the forests of Southwest Virginia, and it is impossible for us to actually leave our house without seeing bumper stickers of the wood booger, and people have these cutouts out of wood they paint black and tie next to trees in their yards, and it's a big thing for people to have these. They sell cement statues of Bigfoot all over the place.
Somebody I know has been wanting to get one for quite
you know what I'm
some time.
saying? Like, if anybody wants to donate a Bigfoot statue to us for our yard, we will shout you out and gladly put it out there next to our garden and our raised beds.
Well, yeah, we would though.
But anyways, locally, the wood booger in folklore kind of became the boogeyman of the South in the forest. People would tell their kids not to go out at night so they wouldn't get lost, or the wood booger or the boogeyman would take them. But now, mostly anything that has to do with Bigfoot that I hear locally is just usually positive, and it's more of elusive and just runs away or fucks with people's farms and around their houses. And
didn't you say there's like reports of it braiding horses' hair or something?
Yeah, people say they will sneak in their barns and help take care of their animals sometimes, and they'll braid their horses' hair, which is also something you'll hear in a lot of fairy stories around the world. A lot of my family is into law enforcement, and they always have police scanners on. My father is a sheriff's deputy, and people call in all the time with reports of big, hairy, shadowy, dark men or creatures around their farms, tapping on their windows, running around doing stuff. And I actually heard one, just a few months ago. I was just over at my mom's house, and they just so happened to call in, and somebody was saying there was a big hairy man running around their yard.
What?
And the wood booger is extremely popular. People wear t-shirts and hats. I have a hat, and it's really like...
And a shirt.
It's kind of an accepted thing around here. People just really, for the most part, believe that it exists, or it's at least a fun cultural thing.
Definitely
And
a cultural icon.
actually, not far from where we live, the city of Norton, Virginia has many attractions named after the wood booger. This city has also been declared a sanctuary for wood booger, and since 2014, there's an annual wood booger festival where visitors can go on guided tours to search for this creature.
And just to give you an idea, when we say it's like the city is a sanctuary, it's really like the mountains outside and above the city, because you sort of turn out of it and immediately start winding directly up the mountain. And there's some very interesting geological formations at the top. The rocks are like wild, and very pretty views. It's just a very pretty wooded area where, due to the nature of how steep it is, you can't really build anything there. So it's just sort of the swath of wooded mountain.
A statue of the wood booger is located at Flag Rock, and there is a plaque at Flag Rock. So I'll actually put a picture of this plaque up in the video too, so you can see that and pictures of the statue. The plaque was put up after the television show Finding Bigfoot made a stop here, and they made an episode about it. And it first starts out with a little bit about that, and it talks about how there is an emphasis in the sightings and experiences with Bigfoot around High Knob, Virginia. High Knob is a peak of Stone Mountain that forms part of the border between Scott County, Virginia and Wise County. And it's really near Norton, and the main road that goes up to Flag Rock, you can take that road out and be on High Knob. And that's where a lot of people hunt and fish. And I've actually got a story to tell you guys from one of my dad's close friends growing up. I'm not going to say his name, but I'll tell you his encounter after we read this plaque and talk about the wood booger a little bit more.
City of Norton, Virginia. Resolution declaring a Sasquatch/Bigfoot sanctuary. Whereas the television show Finding Bigfoot made a stop in Southwest Virginia in 2011 and filmed an episode concerning Bigfoot or Sasquatch, locally known as the wood booger, sightings in the Norton area, with an emphasis on the High Knob recreation area. And whereas if the elusive creature is as scarce and as rare as is believed by those who seek it, and whereas if the High Knob and adjoining city of Norton recreational areas are possible habitat for the creature, and whereas if the creature is, as it appears to be, an endangered species, now, therefore, it is resolved by the Norton City Council that the city of Norton is hereby declared a Sasquatch / Bigfoot / Wood Booger sanctuary.
Woo!
Woo! Be it further resolved that the city of Norton welcomes all those who seek to find and photograph the creature without causing injury to it or damaging the habitat in which it may reside. Pretty cool.
Excellent. So Norton, Virginia is a sanctuary for the wood booger. All over town, they sell merchandise at different businesses of Bigfoot. There's the Wood Booger Bar and Grill. It's actually one of our favorite places to go eat. Here's some pictures of us over there doing our Sasquatchy thing. And it's one of our favorite little family trips. We'll go eat at Wood Booger, then we'll go up to Flattened Rock. And actually, one of my friends found a pretty cool footprint up there. I'll put that in the video for you guys too. You can check that out. It's definitely an interesting little town. It's a cool place to go. Another little shout out is the Squatchy Adventures off of Clinch River Highway in Duffield, Virginia. That is in between where we live and Norton. And it's another big sign you'll see on the road. They do kayaks and camping and stuff like that. And it's all about Sasquatch. Actually, not too far from there, there was a account that happened in August of 2013, and there was an article posted in the Southwest Times in Pulaski County, Virginia, and it showed a picture a guy got on his trail camera of a strange ape-looking creature. If you're watching this on YouTube, that'll be in the video right now. You can check that out. It's interesting, but it's definitely still up for debate if it's a black bear or a Bigfoot, but it does look pretty monkey-like. It definitely looks pretty ape-like. Before we move on, I'll go ahead and tell you the story that happened from my dad's friend. When he was a teenager, he was camping on High Knob. They were up there hunting, and one night he was sleeping in his tent. He said that he woke up and went outside to use the bathroom. So he walked about 25 yards from his tent where everyone was camping, and he pulled his pants down and bent down to start using the bathroom. He said there was like a large dead tree laying on the ground in front of him, and he described a creature that jumped up on this dead tree and started staring at him as a tiger werewolf monkey. He always said it looked like a really strange, almost like a spider monkey, and it just jumped up on the tree, and it had large black eyes, and it was just staring at him, watching him shit next to this tree. And yeah, the thing just looked at him.
Talk about getting caught with your pants down.
Yeah, and he said this creature was probably only about 2 feet tall, and it had
2
really
feet tall,
long arms, long skinny legs, and a long tail.
Maybe it was a
like
spider
a monkey. And he said it jumped off and ran off into the forest. So I just thought that was an interesting account that happened on High Knob. It's an ape-like creature, not what people describe the wood booger looking like, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
Because he described it as, I believe it was a tiger werewolf monkey, right?
Yeah.
Which, you know, just bring that image up in your head. see what comes up. So while we're still on the topic of local Sasquatch-esque entities, there's a historical example that I wanted to mention because it is from the Diaries of Daniel Boone. So this is the Daniel Boone frontiersman who, there's the historical trail that goes up through the Cumberland Gap, and this is the area that we live on the trail. So I thought that was cool that he has this example. So this is an article about the creature that he saw, the Yahoo, from SasquatchResearchers.org. Yeho, or Yahoo, was used by early frontiersmen in North America to refer to a large, hairy, man-like beast. Yeho is the Algonquian Indians' word for Sasquatch, which means wild man. The Algonquian are one of the most populous and widespread native language groups in North America. They were prominent along the Atlantic coast and into the interior along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. From them, the word Yeho came to be used by early frontiersmen, although an alternate pronunciation of Yahoo also emerged, which phonetically is almost identical to Yeho. So maybe I'm pronouncing one of those incorrectly. That's entirely possible. Interestingly, in Jonathan Swift's novel Gulliver Travels from the year 1726, Yahoos were a race of brutish creatures resembling men, but were very large and covered in hair. It's not clear if Swift is responsible for popularizing the word Yahoo for these creatures or not, but the Algonquian use of Yeho certainly predates Jonathan Swift's description of them and could be where Swift's idea originated. Daniel Boone referred to them as Yahoos. Boone, in his memoirs, wrote of shooting and killing a 10-foot-tall hairy Yahoo in 1782 in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, along what is now the Montgomery and Powell County border in Kentucky.
And that's pretty crazy. I mean, he's, as far as like historical figures in the South, he's up there, you know? And this guy's, we take records for all these historical accounts as truth, except like then this guy's talking about, hey, I killed a 10-foot tall hairy Bigfoot, and people are just like, nah, lied about that one.
Totally. So this is his account. In 1782, Daniel Boone was making his way through the Kentucky wilderness when he stopped at a cave to rest up for a few nights. On the morning of the second day, Boone was squatting next to a nearby creek when a deer came bounding out of the bush, narrowly missing Boone as it flew through the air. Boone raised his long rifle and shot and killed a 10-foot Yahoo that was apparently chasing the deer. This was Boone's second sighting of the Yahoo. The night before, Boone was awakened by a falling tree while sleeping in the cave. That same night, he observed this huge creature looming over him, its large figure blotting out the moon and the stars of the sky. It smelled at his provisions and him. Of note, Sasquatches are known to push over trees at times and also chase down deer, so the sighting Daniel Boone recorded in his memoirs certainly coincides with known Sasquatch behavior.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting account for sure. And
this next one, though, is honestly probably my favorite that I've heard. This is from the Foxfire 2 book. So for those that don't know about the Foxfire phenomenon, I'll read a little bit. This is literally just from the back of the book. In 1966, in the Appalachian Mountains of Northeast Georgia, a teacher and his students founded a quarterly magazine they named Foxfire after a phosphorescent lichen. In 1972, several articles from the magazine were published in book form, and the acclaimed Foxfire series was born. Some 30 years later, the books continued to teach a philosophy of simplicity in living that is truly enduring in its appeal. Much more than how-to books, the Foxfire series is a publishing phenomenon and a way of life, teaching creative self-sufficiency, the art of natural remedies, home crafts, and other country folkways, fascinating to everyone interested in rediscovering the virtues of simple living. The second volume celebrates the rites and customs of Appalachia and includes sections on old-time burials, midwives, granny women, witches, and haints, as well as a variety of the kind of spirited first-hand narrative accounts from Appalachian community members that exemplify the Foxfire style. And these books, I remember my grandparents had copies of these because my mom's side of the family is from a different part of Virginia, but they had these books, and I remember reading them and looking through the pictures and just being fascinated of the survivalist lifestyle and learning how to do everything for yourself. When I was a kid, I always loved like the Hatchet books, My Side of the Mountain. And so these were really inspiring to me, just learning about the wisdom of people that live a very different lifestyle.
Yeah, these books are really great. They are a tremendous source of a knowledge of people living off the land, especially in the Appalachian regions, that all these traditional accounts from a bunch of different real people, and it's their stories in their words and how they would take care of things, how they would build things, and a very rich tradition and a really cool kind of window into a type of spirituality and a lifestyle that most people take for granted and don't really know about. There's a really cool story in here of a guy that encountered Sasquatch that's probably one of me and Lucy's favorites of all time, and I'm going to read that for you now.
This is word for word the story as told by a gentleman by the name of Lawton Brooks, whose picture we'll put up on the video.
Bob Meeks was his name, and he was a-working somewhere in Tennessee over there. He came through by Benton while they didn't have the road then, and he had come across that mountain. Now I don't know whether it was a frog mountain, whether it was the name or not, but anyway, there was 22 mile there. There wasn't no houses on it, and it was steep and twisty, my lord. And it was late that night. His wife had called him. Some of his kids got sick, and he hadn't come in. And he's coming along up the mountain, and he said he come around a curve and seen this thing. He said it's the biggest man he ever saw. The thing stepped out of a water ditch by the side of the road, and he said he just leaned over a little, and as he come by, he just stepped on the running board, reached down, opened the door, got in, sat down, looked him over, and it was an old Model T. And the way it was going, it didn't make much more time than a man walking. And he said he looked at the thing, hands, and that's what he couldn't figure out. Says its fingers, one of them was as long as two of his, and they was put together, and as big again around. He said he had awful big arms, and on top of his hands was just as hairy, plump, on down to his fingers. His fingers was the longest he'd seen on anybody. Must have been 10 inches long. He said he spoke to him, and he never did speak back. He said he didn't know whether he was going to do anything to him or not. He said he knowed he was big enough, though. They wouldn't no need of getting scared because that man could have reached plumb around him with one hand. There was nothing he could do about it if he wanted. Big, tall man, all hairy. He said he had a beard way down and face hairy, and said he was kind of nasty looking. An old man. He said he looked as old as the hills. Said he never got a sound out of him, but he could hear him getting his breath. And he rode at least 3 miles with him, and he wondered if this thing was going to go plumb to Ducktown with him. And he was going around another curve, and he said this thing, the man, wherever it was, he just stepped out, and he said he looked back, and it's just a-standing there in the road. He said it was the ungodliest man he had ever seen in all the days of his life. He said people might not believe him, but he said it's true. Now I'll believe it, 'cause I don't believe Bob telling no lies. He was a man never got excited about nothing. And after that man got out, Bob said he just kept on driving on. We're going to take a quick music break. We thank you for listening to Fabled Remedies, and we'll be right back to explore some more high strangeness of the Bigfoot phenomenon. By observation, I feel like I can speak for many of us when I say that Bigfoot was the genesis of our interest in the world of the paranormal. Something about the concept of an unknown or undiscovered animal is exciting, and it's easy to stomach for our cultural belief systems. But in the case of Sasquatch, it really doesn't take much digging before you come face to face with a wave of high strangeness that shouldn't be so easily dismissed as tall tales or the blabbering of the insane. Personally, I'm an extremely open-minded and curious person by nature, but I also find myself extremely skeptical in many cases, especially seeing the flood of content coming out of mainstream paranormal TV shows and creepypasta culture. You really have to take all these stories with a grain of salt, but like I always say, whether you're talking about fairies, ghosts, Sasquatch, or UFOs, it only takes one account being real to make the whole field of the paranormal a worthwhile pursuit. And for us that have lived through these kinds of experiences for ourselves, do we really need the government or some other kind of validation to accept the reality that these things exist, however unexplainable that they may be? We are all on our personal quest for meaning of the transcendental, so let your self-truth be unshakable. Now I would like to quickly list a few examples of correspondences that I've noticed in my research of many cases of the paranormal. Whether it be related to Sasquatch, ufology, fairy folklore, or hauntings, there are certain tropes that come up over and over again that when looked at across the board imply that these kinds of phenomenon may be far closer related than first meets the eye. For example, things like disembodied voices, strange languages, items being stacked on top of each other, thrown, taken, or hidden, bumps in the night, intense odors, anomalous lights, unexplained footsteps, subterranean layers, electronical interference, invisibility, shape-shifting, gifting cultures, miraculous healing, abduction, and personal relationships with these beings that can be aggressive, helpful, or tricky in nature depending on the relationship, and last but not least, government or men in black cover-ups.
That's quite a list.
It's a huge list, but all these kinds of experiences come up time and time again across all the fields of the paranormal. And now I'm going to try to give you as many examples of high strangeness related to Bigfoot that I can fit into a short podcast. But as we continue into the journey of the weirdness of the world, these kinds of experiences are inescapable and come up time and time again, whether it be with aliens, wild men, nature spirits, or ghosts. First, let's look at a very commonly reported phenomenon in Sasquatch cases, being vocalizations ranging from disembodied voices, heavy breathing, screams, singing, whispers, growls, mimicking animals, people's voices, and in some cases using infrasound to paralyze the contactee. One of these incidents happened in 1977 when a Chinese farmer observed a wild man that he said uttered about 11 or 12 different sounds. He recalled the creature to be mimicking the sounds of a sparrow chirping, a dog barking, and neighing like a horse before letting out a growl he described to be like a leopard. And in my opinion, the creepiest of all, a human infant crying.
Oh.
Yeah, that's pretty weird.
I would, if I just heard that coming out of the forest.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wild man just doing all these kinds of vocalizations. I'd be out of there before the second one.
Yeah.
Similarly, in North America, Bigfoot is ascribed to have mimicking skills. One of the most iconic pieces of Bigfoot vocalization evidence to date are the Sierra Sounds, recorded in 1971 by Ronald J. Moorhead and Alan Berry during an outing between Lake Tahoe and Yosemite National Park. The recordings depict guttural animalistic vocalizations that are attributed to Sasquatch. And I'll go ahead and I'll play you a short clip from those recordings now.
I think that recording, it starts out totally plausible with the interesting echoing wood knocks and sort of like far away animal sounding noises. But it starts going crazy and like making like like all of that stuff. I don't know. If it is some sort of ape-like creature, he must look ridiculous. Like that sounds so silly.
This is just a really short mashup of a few clips from them. There was a bunch of different recordings that they got interacting with these supposed Bigfoot creatures, and there's definitely a reason that sometimes they're referred to as the samurai Bigfoot sounds.
Yeah, totally.
Because
I can see that.
In a few of the recordings, it gets pretty ridiculous, but there still is the chance that this was a real interaction with Bigfoot-like creatures.
Who knows? Maybe they just sound like us because they are like us.
Next, let's look at rocks and items being thrown, things being taken or hidden, and sometimes even later showing up in random locations. This behavior is extremely common throughout historical records with Bigfoot encounters, and here are a few quick examples.
An 1877 newspaper article from Bennington, Pennsylvania mentioned a fat, hairy, wild man with an affinity for throwing stones at barns.
It must have been one of my ancestors.
Sounds like he was partying. Another account from a national park maintenance man driving through Northern California reported a light brown, hairy man-sized creature tossing rocks at him. In 2005, a Virginia policeman heard a loud vocalization from a distant ridge while camping. Once his comrades fell asleep, he began to notice repetitive clicking sounds. Though they were coming from pebbles bouncing off a nearby picnic table, he couldn't see from where or anyone throwing them. The next morning, he distinctly heard a strange language drifting from the nearby woods that he described as sounds like a weird mixture of Russian, Asian, and Eastern European. That's interesting.
Yeah. So there you have
something
the
like
strange vocalizations and things
throwing.
Being thrown.
Yeah.
Many times, rocks striking homes or being thrown in the forest from an unseen force are attributed to Bigfoot. But what about when the same thing happens inside a home? Like in the beginning of 1965, when a family in Brazil endured a rain of bricks inside their house, followed by a shower of stones that were 312 in total. Or in the famous Humpty Doo poltergeist case in Australia, what a great name.
Humpty Doo. It doesn't sound menacing at all. It's just old Humpty Doo.
Oh, Humpty Doo poltergeist.
Stacks our chairs and stuff.
This happened in Australia, and it produced rocks still hot to the touch when the witnesses picked them up. We are going to try to fit as many accounts as we can into a short time for you in this podcast, but honestly, it would be really difficult to exhaust the examples of similarities in these kinds of stories. And when it comes to Bigfoot, footprints are the most common form of evidence to support its existence. When a footprint is found, a plaster cast of the print is often taken, and many casts have been looked at by professionals and are said to contain dermal ridges. Dermal ridges are similar to fingerprints, and all known primates have them, like the famous August 27th, 1958 account by Jerry Crew, a rogue construction worker in Bluff Creek, California. He found prints 18 inches in length and 7 in width, circling his parked bulldozer.
That's a Bigfoot.
That's a Bigfoot. Casts were taken of the tracks, and a columnist at the Humboldt Times named Andrew Genzoli introduced the name Bigfoot in an article titled Giant Footprints Puzzle Residents Along Trinity River. Hand and footprints are also a common experience in the cases of hauntings and poltergeist activity. Like ghosts leaving watery footprints or in powder spilled across floors, Bigfoot tracks are almost always lacking a path entering or exiting the areas that they appear, and they stopped abruptly in the middle of forest and fields.
multidimensional Sasquatch. Now let's talk about wood knocks, or what goes bump in the night. Wood knocks are believed to be some kind of Bigfoot communication, and they are a common method deployed on Bigfoot research expeditions. In many cases, Sasquatch are accused of knocking and slapping on the walls, windows, and roofs of homes. Like in 1973, a Pennsylvania family reported sulfurous odors, shadowy apparitions, and odd screams in the area around their home. On the evening of August 24th, they distinctly heard something heavy walking on their rooftop. Also to be noted, this incident took place in the same time frame of many UFO sightings in that area. It's easy to see, then, how all you have to do is take the sounds of knocking into one's home from the forest, and it becomes a ghost instead of a Bigfoot, right?
And a little less known example may be the fairy folklore of the knockers. The knocker, knacker, or Tommy knocker is a mystical subterranean gnome-like creature in Cornish or Devon folklore. They are reported to be short with large heads and thick, hairy beards. They are spirits that are found in mine shafts that would knock on the cavern walls to either warn miners from danger or guide them to riches in the earth. They are generally considered benevolent, but are also tricksters who would hide tools, throw pebbles, and extinguish candles. One interpretation holds that they are mine spirits, believed to be the ghost of someone who died working the mines. To show appreciation and to avoid future peril, the miners cast the last bits of their meals into the mines for the knockers. They were mostly reported to be invisible or living inside the cave walls, but in some cases showed themselves as an orb of light almost like that of a miner's lamp. Which brings us to our next example of high strangeness in the Bigfoot phenomenon.
And that is anomalous lights, orbs, and electrical interference. Strange orbs of light are actually one of the most common kinds of paranormal activity across all fields of ufology, hauntings, and fairy lore. Reports date far back into ancient times of glowing balls of light descending from the sky to the earth or even landing in the ocean. There are also the legendary will-o'-the-wisp from British folklore, phantom lights that hover in the wilderness, luring travelers away from the beaten path.
And a few quick famous examples of this phenomenon going on in the U.S. today are the strange lights near Brown Mountain in North Carolina, or the Marfa and Bragg Road ghost lights in Texas. Bragg Road, or sometimes called Ghost Road, is famous for sightings of a white, yellow, or reddish-green light that sways back and forth like a railroad worker carrying a lantern. The light may back away when approached or shoot up into the sky. It may also skim the hoods of cars. This dirt road is situated in the heart of Big Thicket, a more than 80,000 acres in size sprawling mass of forest land, and it turns out it's also a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings. An article from mysteriousuniverse.org by Nick Redfern talked about Rob Riggs, the author of a 2001 book appropriately titled In the Big Thicket. Riggs uncovered a massive amount of data and witness testimony demonstrating that wild, monstrous things inhabited the darkest regions of the Big Thicket. As with so many other encounters across the United States, the phenomena of the Big Thicket man-beast existed before the term Bigfoot was coined. Riggs himself has confirmed this, and he said, "The first I heard of Big Thicket's wild man was in the mid-1950s as a 10-year-old boy, growing up in Sour Lake. My grandpa had been planning for weeks to take me and my older brother Mickey on an overnight camping and fishing trip. Just days before we were to leave, rumors began flying around Hardin County that a wild man wearing no clothes but covered with hair had been seen in the northern part of the county in the dense bottomland forest along Village Creek. This was the very place we intended to go." Rob's research dated back to 1979, and he said, "I have been investigating the Bigfoot phenomenon for over 30 years. I'm reluctant to use the word Bigfoot because I can't say for sure that what we're investigating here is the same animal that's seen in the Pacific Northwest. Rob uncovered data of encounters with huge ape-like animals from the 1960s up into the present day, as well as highly controversial but deeply intriguing accounts suggesting a connection between the wild men and Big Thicket's residential ghost lights, and even stories of isolated pockets of Native Americans living deep in the most dense parts of the woods.
Paranormal investigators often report the ability of spirits to kill electronics, whether it be draining batteries almost instantly or causing camera malfunctions. Well, it turns out this is something many Bigfoot hunters have experienced as well. An example being back in 1993 when the Bigfoot Research Project, the first serious attempt to capture Sasquatch on trail cameras, made use of a direct video feed fed into an off-site VHS recorder and was plagued by mysterious problems with its electronic gear, causing numerous issues. Ron Moorhead, producer of the Sierra Sounds, noticed similar difficulties with his equipment, stating, "We had our cameras, all something going wrong with them. Our batteries would go dead up there in the Sierras. Scott Nelson, the crypto-linguist that rode up there, he would have his batteries failing. He went up there with enough batteries to last forever, but also they wouldn't work. My batteries, my brand new lithium batteries." This was in 2011. "I was by myself when I heard this big pop right outside my tent. I really think it might have not been something hitting a tree like I originally thought, but maybe something energetically coming out of the tree. When I heard the chatter later, I tried to turn my recorder on and the batteries were dead. Brand new lithium batteries. I just put them in when I got there. I checked them and everything was fine. Then they wouldn't work later."
Yeah, and that's interesting. It seems like he's saying that he thought the sound that people would describe as a wood knock was actually like almost a portal opening up in the tree, like an electrical sound, like something coming through.
Yeah, a lot of times with the ghost shows, they say it's like, oh, this is how the spirits are gaining energy to communicate with us, or they're like specifically messing with us. But here it kind of makes it sound like he's saying it's just a side effect of an energetic, like electromagnetic signature of the Sasquatch.
I've even personally experienced orbs of light myself multiple times in my life. I used to live in Michigan for a few years, and we would go hang out at Lake Michigan. And on the coast there, multiple times I saw these basketball-sized white lights kind of wisping out of the forest. They would fly out over the lake and actually go into the water and come back out multiple times before going in the water and disappearing. Also, in a house that I grew up in, the laundry room one time, I saw only a few feet away from my face a basketball-sized glowing white orb materialize in the air above our washer and dryer machine. And it just hovered in the air for a few seconds and then just sucked back into itself and disappeared. And that account also took place here in the local area of Southwest Virginia. Ancient stories involving subterranean layers, mounds, mining operations, and abducting or taking people underground are commonplace when it comes to the lore of dwarfs, elves, fairies, trolls, and ogres. But it turns out that these kinds of experiences are another interesting correspondence in the cases of Sasquatch. Many sightings and encounters have taken place in or near caves, cavernous regions, abandoned mines, or potential entrances to unknown underground areas. And here are a few quick examples of what I'm talking about. In 1920, a gorilla allegedly took up residence in a Mifflin, Pennsylvania mine. In 1969, a team of artifact seekers exploring an Oregon cave experienced odd events, including the discovery of large footprints and a glimpse of a beast over 7 feet tall that looked like a giant ape or gorilla. It was entirely covered with short, shaggy hair. In 1982, James Edenshaw saw a Bigfoot in Bear Valley, Alaska, sleeping just inside the entrance of a cave. Another interesting account happened on June 9th in 1857. This comes from an issue of Salem's Weekly Oregon Statesman. It printed a sensational account of a man and his ward who, while searching for livestock, overnighted in the forest. After a loud, plaintive cry roused the boy, a hairy man about 12 or 15 feet high, with glowing eyes like liquid balls of fire appeared and seized him. The boy's capturer hastily transported him to a trap door and ladder leading into a subterranean lair. It was illuminated with a peculiar phosphorescent lighting. Above, the cave seemed slightly arched, and the ceiling apparently composed of seashells of every conceivable shape and color. From somewhere deeper in the cave, he could hear strains of the most unearthly music. After disappearing for a moment, the beast returned, accompanied by a young and delicate female of almost miraculous grace and beauty, who strangely placed in the boy's hands a beautifully embossed card, upon which appeared the following words: "Boy, depart henceforth, or remain and be devoured." The boy took heed, and during an opportune moment of absence from his captors, pried the trapdoor open with his knife and was able to make his escape.
Well, I think that obviously is a weird one, but the subterranean aspect is interesting because, obviously this concept is really big in this area, but we also have a crazy amount of caves and cavern systems in this area under the mountains. So maybe that's something. One of the most common tropes in Bigfoot encounter experiences is rock throwing or having rocks thrown at you. So interestingly, the Native American Yakama tribe has a lore of the Steyeha. Ste meaning spirit, Ye is hiding, and Ha is the cover of the woods, meaning a spirit hiding under the cover of the woods. These beings were believed to live in the mountains in lodges underground, whose doorways were covered with dirt or snow and almost impossible to find. Their language is said to mimic notes of birds and animals, mostly nocturnal. They would throw sticks through any opening of the hunter's lodge or teepees and shower sticks upon belated travelers, which the mimicking was from that story earlier. There's so many things that you just keep hearing over and over.
Exactly. That's kind of the whole point of what I'm trying to get across with this podcast, is to really show that this is a phenomenon going on all through time, all over the world, whether you want to subscribe it to a Bigfoot or a ghost or whatever, it's...
What does it mean?
What does it mean? And one of the most celebrated Bigfoot cases in the history of the phenomenon was from a group of 5 miners working a gold claim back in July of 1924. It's generally known as the Ape Canyon incident and took place a few miles away from Mount St. Helens. There are far too many reports of high strangeness found around Mount St. Helens to cover on this podcast, but as a side note, I recommend checking out the documentary The Mount St. Helens Bigfoot Cover-Up Story on YouTube if you want to go down the rabbit hole of a government or deep state cover-up in Bigfoot. And I'll try to link as many of these sources I can in the show notes for you all. But back to the Ape Canyon incident.
The group of 5 miners were staying in a small cabin near the mine. They had been finding large, man-like footprints around the nearby springs and creek beds, some measuring 18 inches in length. At night, they had been hearing disturbing noises. Fred Beck, one of the miners, described the sounds as a shrill, peculiar whistling. We could hear coming from one ridge and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound. One night, after their evening meal, Fred, along with another miner, Hank, went to a nearby spring to gather some water. When they reached the spring, about 100 yards distant, they spied a 7-foot-tall creature covered with black-brown hair. The creature ducked behind a tree, but Hank raised his rifle and fired 3 shots. The creature took off running, fast and upright. Fred fired 3 more shots at the creature before it disappeared from their view. What followed was the infamous Attack at Ape Canyon, which took its name from this incident. The miners had settled into sleep in their rustic abode when, about midnight, a loud thumping noise on the side of the cabin awoke them. Outside, they could hear what sounded like multiple sets of footsteps around the cabin. Hank looked out through a space between the logs where the chinking had been knocked loose by the creatures. He saw 3 creatures, but the miners agreed it sounded like there were many more outside. The miners were in for a harrowing night. Their cabin was being attacked in waves. A great many rocks were thrown, hitting the roof, walls, and even falling down the chimney. The creatures climbed on the roof of the cabin and pushed against the door with such force it had to be braced from the inside with a pole. The creatures pushed against the walls as if trying to turn the cabin over. The miners fired their rifles through the roof and through the door whenever they heard the creatures. At one point, one of the creatures even reached through the gap in the logs and grabbed an axe. Like, bad call, move the axe away from the hole in the wall, if this is happening to you. Come on. It's like Scary Movie 101. Fred quickly turned it in the creature's hand so it wouldn't fit through the gap as Hank fired his gun. It let go of the axe and the miners placed the tool out of reach. There you go. The creatures continued to attack the cabin until just before dawn. After daybreak, the miners came out of the cabin cautiously. Fred caught sight of one of the creatures about 80 yards distant and fired 3 shots. It toppled over a cliff and into a deep gorge. The miners left immediately, packing out only what they could carry and leaving hundreds of dollars of mining equipment behind. Yeah, but to be fair, they shot first. He just came back with his bros, like, oh, is that how you want to do it? Well, take a shower of rocks all night long.
And really, though, here again, you have whistling animal-like noises, you have wood knocks and bumps, you have groups of miners working in a gold claim, and then you have these Bigfoot-like creatures showing up. And also, by far, the most well-known and talked about alleged Bigfoot kidnappings concerned a Canadian prospector named Albert Osmond. This is from another article over at mysteriousuniverse.org by Brent Swanser. In 1924, Osmond went on a vacation to the rugged wilderness near Toba Inlet, British Columbia, Canada. One of his purposes at the time was to try and find what he claimed to be a long-lost gold mine. He was convinced that it existed out there in the dense forest, and while on his journey into this remote badland, Osmond's Indian guide told him that the man who had allegedly originally found the lost gold mine was rumored to have been killed by a Sasquatch, which was, according to Osmond, the first time he had ever heard of such a creature, despite having long been a hardened outdoorsman. The Indian explained about the large hairy man-like beast they called the Sasquatch, and told of the large footprints they left behind, but Osmond at the time did not believe a word of it, instead chalking it up to crazy old native legends. Not long after this, the two men made camp and Osmond headed out on his own with some supplies in his pack and armed with a rifle and hunting knife to investigate a pass through the mountains that he had seen, as well as to do some prospecting. After a few days of camping alone out in the wilderness, some rather odd things were noticed by Osmond. One morning, he found that some of his items in his camp had been moved around, although nothing had been taken, and Osmond slept that night with his rifle within easy reach, thinking that perhaps a porcupine or some other animal had come and picked up some of his stuff. The following morning, he found his backpack had been emptied out, but was still oddly hanging from where he had left it, and this time some of the things were missing. An examination of the camp turned up no footprints, and the intrusion did not seem to be the work of animals since nothing had been torn apart or haphazardly ransacked or strewn about. For 3 nights in a row, the mysterious intruder visited the camp unseen, and all efforts by Osmond to stake out the camp to find the trespasser in the act were to no avail. On the 4th night of these strange incidents, Osmond went to bed fully clothed with both his knife and rifle within easy reach, and this time he had intended to stay awake all night in order to catch the trespasser, but he eventually fell into a deep sleep. At some point, he claims he was awoken by something picking him up, sleeping bag and all. For 3 hours, Osmond was carried, unable to move, and with various equipment sticking into him uncomfortably. He could only wait there in the encroaching dark and see where he was being taken. Whatever had captured him seemed to be taking Osmond uphill, as he could feel each step lifting upwards, and he began to notice that the thing was breathing heavily, as well as occasionally letting out coughing noises and strange chattering sounds that he would later claim to be some sort of language. Suddenly, his sleeping bag was dumped onto the ground, and he warily peeked outside. He could vaguely make out large, dark shapes and hear what sounded like several large creatures chattering unintelligibly. And it seemed to be a family of the large, very hairy humanoids his old Indian guide had told him about. According to him, there were 2 big ones, which seemed to be the father, which was a massive specimen about 8 feet tall, and the mother, as well as 2 smaller ones which looked to be children, a boy and a girl, being around 6 to 7 feet tall. The creatures did not seem threatening or aggressive towards him at all, and indeed the young ones seemed a little frightened of him, but neither did they seem ready to let him leave either. According to Osmond, for the next 6 days, the family of Sasquatch forcibly kept him there, with the large male constantly nearby and sitting at the only obvious escape route. During this time, Osmond claimed that the family of creatures took shelter in a cliffside cavern or overhang lined and covered with bark and dry mosses. And he also claimed that the creatures spoke to each other using what was obviously some sort of language rather than random grunts and growls. And he even claimed that he was able to pick up on certain words they used for things. For instance, when the adult male wanted Osmond to sit down and stay put, he would say, "Soka, soka." And when they offered him water, they used the word ook every time. The more time he spent with them, the more complex their communication seemed, and they even seemed to be using gestures and facial expressions to communicate ideas, as well as foot stomps.
Interesting.
The family of Sasquatch also offered Osmond food in the form of nuts and a type of sweet grass over his 6 days with them. His first few tries to escape met with failure, but finally one day Osmond opened up a new box of snuff and took a dose, and at the same time the adult male had reportedly suddenly snatched it away from him and emptied the entire container into its mouth, even going so far as to thoroughly lick out the remains. As predicted, the male Sasquatch fell violently ill, and Osmond made a run for it, reportedly firing his rifle over the mother's head as she pursued him and scaring her off. After some time of slogging through the wilderness, ever wary of being followed by a family of Sasquatch, Osmond was finally rescued by some loggers and brought back to civilization. Osmond would keep his story quiet for decades, afraid of ridicule, until increasing reports of Bigfoot sightings in the 1950s persuaded him to finally come forth with his sensational tale in 1957.
And honestly, I kind of like that story because it's not really threatening at all. It kind of sounds like they thought that maybe he was some lost, like, weird Bigfoot mutant that was like living by himself out in the woods, and they're like, you know, if their children are 6 or 7 feet tall, they might have thought he was like a weird baby or something, and they were like, here, we'll take care of you. No, don't you run off in the woods. Like, now sit down and eat your nuts and your sweet grass, and like, we're gonna take care of you.
Yeah, and I find the use of a language really interesting. Another example of a gold miner looking for a gold claim. And whether you believe Bigfoot is a flesh and blood undiscovered ape, or some kind of nature spirit, or a visitor from a distant world, this topic is still ripe for discovery. And we have done our absolute best to give you an honest overview of the topic. We will definitely have to dive back into the lost lands of Bigfoot on a part 2 episode in the future, because there is just far too many threads to this story to cover in one show. But there are many podcasts out there dedicated to the Bigfoot topic, and if you're looking for more information, I highly recommend checking out Sasquatch Chronicles. Episode 515 and 620 are my favorite. Episode 515 is called I Shouldn't Be Alive, and episode 620 is called This Thing Was Looking in My Deer Blind, and two of the best accounts of witnesses of these creatures, in my opinion, that sound very authentic in their stories. If you want to check that out, Sasquatch Syndicate and the Confessionals podcast are two other shows I really love, and let them know that Fabled Remedies sent you. So before we wrap the show up today, I just found too many really cool, odd, and strange stories when I was doing this research that I don't want to leave out. So we're going to try to throw as many of those at you as we can before we wrap this thing up today.
In 2001, in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, I may have pronounced that incorrectly, a family of 5 claimed to have been terrorized by a poltergeist, which growled, rang telephones, spoke in multiple languages, lobbed produce at anyone inside the home, and smeared lotions and detergents on the walls. According to the youngest son, age 10, the poltergeist appeared as hairy and ape-like with sharp nails. During the Battersea poltergeist case, the couple's daughter, 15-year-old Shirley, experienced the sensation of something hairy in her bed one evening. When her father looked, the sheet and mattress were ripped to shreds. Oh, I don't like that one.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah. During his 1902 Parisian seances, medium Auguste Politi levitated a table, produced anomalous lights, and touched sitters with a hairy hand, all while bound at the neck, wrists, and feet.
Keep your hairy hands to yourself out there.
In 1888, essayist Louise Goigny described the Isle of Man's Faino de Riz, or hairy one, known for helping shepherds and gathering hay. He was a wild little shaggy being, supposed to be in exile from fairy society, and condemned to walk about alone until doomsday. The Faino de Riz was a regional brownie variant. These specific types, more than any other fairy, regularly display behavior associated with Bigfoot.
And here's a few alien-like encounters that involved Bigfoot. In 1957 in New York, multiple campers observed a strange light in the sky around Wingdale. As the craft draws near, they spot 2 orange-tan Bigfoot at the helm, each wearing goggles. The closest creature slowly turned 90 degrees, providing a very clear view. It has the appearance of a super intelligent Borneo orangutan, with a huge mouth and 2 long fangs protruding from the upper jaw.
That kind of sounds like a skunk ape.
Oh yes, alien skunk apes wearing goggles. The primary witness clearly notes piercing blue eyes through the clear goggles, and the pair form a internal indelible mind link. The craft then disappeared from view. In 1969 in Canada, 2 14-year-old boys in Ontario claimed a Bigfoot grabbed them, taking them aboard a landed flying saucer. Inside, several shorter creatures described like doctors allegedly examined and implanted them with some type of device. The entire time their captors watched from a chair, wires stretching from his hairy head to the nearby machine.
Yeah.
In 1975 in California, a recluse in the woods near Burnt Ranch reports a large light that hovered over his shack, dropping out several hairy monsters to the ground. The witness disappears shortly thereafter. Another really interesting phenomenon with Bigfoot, and Lucy mentioned one earlier in the podcast, is miraculous healings, and here are a few quick examples of that.
Healing Bigfoot appear in an August 1921 sighting from California. One Alberta Payne claimed she was bedridden with typhoid fever in her grandmother's Mount Shasta home when two huge furry black creatures with big eyes looked through the window. Her recovery was almost immediate. Similarly, Kiwani Lapsaritis claims his first extraterrestrial or Bigfoot encounter healed his ruptured disc for which he had been wheelchair bound. Lapsaritis, which I have no idea if that's right, but this person also claimed to have witnessed 2 ETs and 3 Sasquatch and a nearly fatal asthma attack in May 1989. The beings appeared while he prayed over the victim, perhaps responding to telepathic request. When I reached out to touch the woman, an intense electrical energy shot through my system as if it was sent from a powerful vibrator, he wrote in Fate magazine. To my amazement, To my amazement, the woman let out a gentle sigh and instantly began to breathe normally.
Sorry.
No, I don't want to. No, that one's, no, we'll cut that one. Another account was related to investigator W.J. Vogel, circa 1974. A Yakima Indian fire guard told Vogel a large man with red eyes came to live with the tribe. Whenever any of the Indian people became sick, he would heal them. When the large hominid noticed his own health failing, he asked the tribe to take him to a specific location where he died, and a large flying object came down from the skies, put his body aboard, and flew off into the sky. So what does that mean?
Now that's a crazy story.
Mm-hmm. Another thread common in some of these experiences is invisibility. According to the July 16, 1918 Seattle Times, mountain devils attacked a prospector's cabin near Mount St. Helens, Washington. The devils were said to be members of a local race, intermediate between men and animals, with magical powers and the ability to make themselves invisible. In 1926, a group of teens near Kolomenskoye, Russia, happened upon a tall, hairy creature stealing apples from an orchard.
Shout out to episode number 2.
Hashtag apples.
When we get down with the apples.
As they approached the beast, it vanished into thin air. In 1973, a Miami, Florida security guard saw an enormous, hairy creature standing in the bed of an electrical truck on his shift. It suddenly blinked out of existence. On August 11th, 1979, several students in Malaysia encountered a trio of 10-foot-tall hairy figures with red eyes. They allegedly blinked out of existence, and the ensuing panic caused a temporary school closure. Totally wasn't some kids.
No, we're not just trying to get out of school.
I just saw 3 Bigfoot. We need to close down the school.
Man, I wish I would have thought of that one.
You never know.
You
You got to take everything with a grain of salt. But like you were saying at the beginning of this episode, if even one of these is accurate, then that opens up a whole realm of possibility for what is going on out here.
And exactly, there is just far too many of these stories for every single one to be fake. And I get it. When you start talking about being immune to being shot with bullets or being able to turn invisible and Bigfoot on UFOs, I mean, this stuff gets pretty out there. But I myself have seen things that I don't expect anyone to believe. I like to at least give people the chance for them to just share their stories and have enough respect to look at their accounts with an open mind.
Well, as we wrap up the roller coaster ride that is the conceptualization of Bigfoot and all things hairy and wild in the forest, I wanted to draw some parallels between our mythic figures at the beginning of our journey, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, to another famous set of literary counterparts, King Arthur and the wizard Merlin. So first of all, who was Merlin exactly? Because I had the idea, I knew he was a famous magician from history. I knew he was associated with King Arthur, but that was pretty much the scope of my understanding of his story as a character, and a literary / historical figure. So this is from KingArthursKnights.com. King Arthur's most trusted advisor, prophet, magician, and friend, Merlin, was almost certainly the creation of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes extensively about Merlin in his 12th century work, The History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey combined tales and stories of a bard and wizard named Myrddin, who was created by a 9th century mystic named Nennius. Or those are the earliest chronicles we know of. Nennius chronicled that Myrddin had been born of no earthly father and used his wizardry and powers to foretell the defeat of the British by the Saxons. The information about him having no earthly father is repeated in the Vulgate Cycle manuscript from the year 1316. And for those watching the video, we're going to put up a little picture of this. But there is a detail of a miniature portraying God opening hell, in which devils gather and plot to create an evil being by fathering a child on a mortal woman. This child, through baptism and blessings, is made good and grows up to be the wizard Merlin. So although his legend centers on a known Celtic theme, Myrddin, this initial iteration, this legend is rooted in history, for he is said to have gone mad after the Battle of, and I apologize on these Welsh pronunciations, the Battle of Arfdeed at Arthuret. And according to the 12th century document, the Annals of Wales, Myrddin fled into the forest after this defeat, living with the animals, and during this time receiving the gift of prophecy. Around this time, there was a widespread belief across much of Europe that if a man or a woman decided to live among the beasts in dense and foreboding forests and woodland, he or she would inevitably become more and more animalistic as time passed by. Eventually, it was accepted they would become wild people in the literal sense of the term, nothing less than fully fledged, hair-covered beasts of the trees. The name for this historical character is a wodwose, derived from the Old English wudu, wood or forest. This is from secretsuffolk.com. A wodwose is a hairy, forest-dwelling embodiment of nature, closely linked in its symbolism to the Green Man. Both the wodwose and the Green Man are depicted in medieval church architecture. They are depicted covered in hair, bearing a club or a shield, and sometimes locked in combat with a wyvern, which is a legendary winged dragon that is bipedal and usually depicted with a tail ending in a diamond or arrow-shaped tip. But why are the wodwose present in church decoration at all? The wodwose was a feature of medieval seasonal folk festivals, leading processions and engaging in mock battles with personifications of summer and winter. His origins may also lie in the liminal woodland beings of heathen belief, the spirits of place and woodland guardians. In Arthurian myth, the wodwose makes an appearance in Gawain and the Green Knight. And Geoffrey of Monmouth describes how Merlin, or Myrddin, retreats into the forest and becomes a man of the woods, hidden, discovered by none, forgetful of himself, lurking like a wild thing. So we have two extremely iconic literary tales where there is this special bond between the ultimate king figure and this other figure who is the wild man, and yet it is the special gifts of the wild man and perspective that help to balance the king and bring him success. But their stories really take off after they find this counterpart, this wild, magical counterpart. So that, stay with me here. This is Fabled Remedies. We want to have the remedy, the healing aspect. What is the healing aspect of Bigfoot, you may ask? Well, that's kind of where this train is headed right now, because we're talking about these relationships that balance each other and these energies that balance each other. And that got me thinking about the work of Swiss psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and founder of analytical psychology, Carl Jung. Anybody who works in the field of mental health knows at least the basics about Jung, as he was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud and worked with him for some time on a joint vision of human psychology before breaking off to follow his own research and convictions. He created some of the best-known psychological concepts, including synchronicity, archetypal phenomena, the collective unconscious, the psychological complex, and extroversion and introversion. So all concepts that I'm sure at least some of those everyone is familiar with. The concept of archetypes is what strikes me with the idea of Sasquatch, however. So what is an archetype? Simply put, an archetype is a set pattern of behavior. Plato referred to archetypes as forms, which he saw as pre-existing ideal templates or blueprints. Archetypes are what Carl Jung called primordial images and the fundamental units of the human mind. Archetypes seek actualization as the individual lives out their life cycle within the context of their environment. According to Jung, this process is called individuation, which he described as an expression of that biological process by which every living thing becomes what it was destined to become from the beginning. It is considered a creative process that activates the unconscious and primordial images through exposure to unexplored potentials of the mind. Archetypes guide the individuation process towards self-realization. And that's kind of what you can see in both of these character stories with Enkidu, Gilgamesh, King Arthur, Merlin, is that it's the combination of these energies that lead to the characters living the journey that they were supposed to live, to becoming the people that they were supposed to be. So we have the king archetype balanced by the wild man archetype, which is another term that has been used for Bigfoot, Sasquatch, etc. So how can we bring balance into our own lives by embracing our inner Sasquatch? Well, from archetypes.com, wild folk are the most outrageous of rebels. These are the people who are in touch with the side of themselves that doesn't want to settle or be forced into any box. Wild folk can be role models for taking the road less traveled. The passions of wild folk are nature, festivals, poetry, singing, spirituality, and storytelling. Society has always had its madmen and madwomen who live far outside any realms of acceptability. In one tale by the Grimm brothers, a hairy, red-headed wild man named Iron John, which I encourage you to look up this story, turns out to be an instructive mentor. The poet and men's movement founder Robert Bly used this story of Iron John to encourage men to embrace the unpredictable rather than the accepted. He gets to write poetry, he sits by the ocean. In other words, the wild man gives responsible men permission to eschew their typical for the surprising. Clarissa Pinkola Estes hits on a similar theme in Women Who Run with the Wolves. She encourages them to overcome a fear of upsetting the status quo. In order to find more truthful lives that are informed as much by gut as intellect, she encourages them to run, get lost, and risk making mistakes in order to find their true callings in the world. The true wild man and wild woman archetype is not a reprobate, but rather a rebellious seeker who knows that ripping down boundaries can help uncover core values, higher ideals, and inner truths.
And I really appreciate you taking the podcast in this direction, because right now we are definitely living in what you could call a cultural crisis. And the archetype of the wild man is kind of, to put it in the terms of Terence McKenna, it's an archaic revival. It's the spirit of where we actually come from. And it's the part of ourselves that has been demonized, and that the culture we live in and that is crumbling around us right now, it built the idea into us that the wild parts of us are something to be afraid of. It's something of the devil. It's something negative. But I personally argue that the spirit of the wild man is exactly what we need now to face the challenges in this world that we're facing.
Totally. You mentioned McKenna, wasn't he the one who said culture is not your friend?
Yeah.
Or something like that?
Terrence, of course, has lots of things to say about lots of things. But his big points really were that culture isn't the truth, and that there is a spirit that is alive in nature, whether you want to connect to it through psychedelic plants or by just journeying deep into the wilderness. Another archetype is the hermit. You could think about nature itself being alive, and maybe Bigfoot could even be a projection from the spirit of nature as a reminder of what's wild in us.
Totally. And there were some of these stories that mentioned how Bigfoot comes around, or Sasquatch comes around, basically as the voice of nature to remind people to care for nature again, like the protector of nature. And so perhaps that has something to do with why Bigfoot is looming so high in the public's consciousness right now, because our nature is well and truly screwed. And so maybe it's like an army of Bigfoots coming to be like, hey, you guys, quit it. Throw some rocks at you so you stop burning toxic shit.
And if you look at what Bigfoot is really doing, a lot of the research groups, what in practical terms, what they accomplish, you have a lot of nature activists. You have a lot of people going out, building community around spending time in nature, cleaning up places. And in a lot of these stories, Bigfoot shows up as a kind of a protective force, whether it be a sacred place in nature or a mine or a river or a waterfall. There's a lot of these places that in cultures past, they would have considered a sacred or what we would call a temple. But this could just be a mountain. This could be a river. And that's where these creatures are usually located. If you look at King Arthur and you look at Gilgamesh, and why would they even need balance of this wild man? It's because when you're totally sucked into a culture, they were the heads, they were the kings of a culture, of a civilization, without the remembrance of where they come from. it will fall apart, and they have lost this essential essence that is crucial to being a human being. That's knowing how to hunt, knowing how to cultivate the land, knowing how to be a custodian, not just something that's sucking the life force from the planet. But our culture and our civilizations, it is crucial that we design them around the archetype of the wild. This was a really fun episode, and this is definitely not the last we've heard from our big hairy friend, Bigfoot. Thank you all so much. We hope you enjoyed this show. If you like what we do, check out fabledremedies.com. There's all kinds of products and artwork on there made by yours truly, and there's links to all of our music and our different podcasts and projects we're working on. And please, if you have any weird or strange stories you would like to share with the show, email us at fabledremedies.com, and maybe we will put them on a future episode. Our goal, as always, is to build a community. Please talk to us, share with us, and let's embrace the weirdness in this world together, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Keep it squatchy.